Welcome to Compact Disasters from compacthistories.com, where we look at catastrophes, accidents and natural disasters in short, bite-sized episodes. Before we start, a quick announcement. A brand new podcast has joined the Compact Histories family. It's called Compact Science, and it brings you clear, straightforward explanations of science-related topics, all in the same short, bite-sized format. Look out for Compact Science wherever you get your podcasts and on compacthistories.com, available now. With that being said, let's get back to the show. This is episode 77, the 2015 Nepal Earthquake. Nepal began the day much as it always did. It was a Saturday, the weekly day off for many people, and in Kathmandu, families were at home, shopkeepers were opening up, and worshippers and visitors were already moving through the old squares and temple areas that had stood for centuries. In the hills and mountain districts beyond the capital, daily life followed familiar rhythms shaped by farming, trekking, trade, and the long geography of a country stretched along the Himalayas. Few people could have guessed that, before noon, Nepal would be facing the deadliest disaster in its modern history. Nepal's vulnerability had not appeared out of nowhere. The country sits in one of the most active seismic zones on Earth, where the Indian plate continues to push northwards into the Eurasian plate. That immense geological pressure helped build the Himalayas, but it also stored enormous strain in the crust beneath Nepal. Scientists had long understood that this part of the Himalayan front was capable of producing a major earthquake, because the energy released by smaller tremors was nowhere near enough to balance the force created by the plates grinding together year after year. At 11:56 a.m. local time on Saturday, the 25th of April 2015, the calm ended. A magnitude 7.8 earthquake struck central Nepal, its epicenter lying northwest of Kathmandu near Gorkha. The quake was caused by thrust faulting on or near the main boundary, where the Indian plate is being forced beneath the Eurasian plate, part of the same immense geological process that created the Himalayas in the first place. This was not a brief jolt that passed in a heartbeat. The shaking was violent enough to tear through buildings, roads, and entire communities, and for people on the ground, it arrived with almost no warning beyond the first strange tremor beneath their feet. What made the moment so destructive was not only the magnitude of the quake, but the way it struck a densely populated and highly vulnerable country. Nepal had many buildings that were not designed to withstand major seismic shocks, especially older brick structures and homes in poorer or more remote areas. As the rupture spread eastwards towards Kathmandu, the force of the earthquake travelled directly into places where homes, schools, temples and hospitals stood close together. In village areas, stone and mud-built houses were especially exposed, and in the capital, the danger came from dense urban neighbourhoods and historic structures already vulnerable to collapse. For survivors, the first minute was pure confusion. Walls split, masonry rained down, and open ground suddenly became the safest place people could imagine. Parents grabbed children, strangers dragged one another clear of debris, and those who could run did so without knowing whether the buildings around them would still be standing seconds later. Power failed in places, communications were disrupted, and dust from fallen structures filled the air. Before officials could even begin to measure the scale of the disaster, ordinary people were already making split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. By the time the shaking stopped, Nepal had crossed a line it could not uncross. The earthquake had announced itself not as a distant geological event, but as a human catastrophe unfolding street by street and village by village. The full devastation would become clear only in the hours and days ahead. As news spread beyond the first shock of the earthquake itself, the scale of the destruction began to come into focus in two places that carried very different meanings for Nepal. One was Kathmandu, the crowded historic capital, where homes, public buildings and priceless cultural landmarks had been battered or reduced to rubble. The other was Mount Everest, where the quake triggered a deadly avalanche at base camp, turning one of the most famous places in the world into another disaster zone. Together, they showed that this was not only a national emergency, but a catastrophe reaching from ancient city streets to the high Himalayas. In Kathmandu, the damage was both human and symbolic. The city's old ceremonial and religious centres, especially the famous Durbar squares, suffered devastating losses. UNESCO's early assessments reported that the monument zones of Kathmandu Valley had been heavily affected, with places such as Hanuman Doka in Kathmandu, Patan Durbar Square, and Bhaktapur, close to ruin, in the immediate aftermath. Later reporting from UNESCO described the damage in even starker terms, noting that about 80% of the temples and historic structures in both Bhaktapur and Kathmandu Durbar squares had been destroyed. These were not just tourist sites. They were living parts of Nepal's history, faith and identity, and their collapse made the disaster visible to the world in heartbreaking detail. Beyond the monuments, the wider city and nearby towns were overwhelmed. More than 600,000 structures in Kathmandu and surrounding areas were damaged or destroyed, leaving huge numbers of people displaced and forcing many to sleep outdoors in fear of further collapses. Streets filled with broken masonry, dust, sirens, and the confusion of families trying to locate missing relatives. Hospitals faced a rush of injured people, while open spaces became makeshift refuges for those too frightened to return indoors. Far above the capital, Everest became the scene of one of the most shocking side effects of the quake. The violent shaking triggered a massive avalanche that swept through base camp. Reports the following day put the death toll there at least 21, making it the deadliest day in the mountain's history up to that point, while dozens more were injured and many climbers were stranded higher on the route after access through the Khumbu icefall was severed. In an instant, a place associated with adventure and endurance had become part of a national tragedy. By the end of those first hours, Nepal's suffering could be seen in shattered temples, broken neighborhoods, and a devastated mountain camp. The earthquake had not struck one kind of place or one kind of people. It had struck the whole image of the nation at once. Once the scale of the disaster became clearer, Nepal entered the next and most urgent phase of the crisis, finding the living, treating the injured, and reaching communities cut off by landslides and damaged roads. In the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, rescue work began not with heavy machinery or perfectly organized systems, but with neighbors, relatives, shopkeepers, police officers, and soldiers digging through debris with their hands, shovels, and anything else they could find. In many places, the first rescuers were simply the people who had survived the collapse and turned back to help others. The Nepal Army, Nepal Police, and armed police force were rapidly deployed, while international urban search and rescue teams also started to arrive. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs reported that the earthquake had affected vast areas of the country and left millions in need of assistance, with relief efforts complicated by the geography of Nepal itself. Mountain villages could not always be reached quickly by road, and in some districts, helicopters became essential for transporting the injured, delivering supplies, and assessing damage. What looked manageable on a map was far harder on the ground, where broken infrastructure, unstable slopes, and continuing tremors slowed every effort. Hospitals, especially in and around Kathmandu, were placed under immense strain. Medical staff had to treat crush injuries, fractures, head wounds, and trauma cases in overwhelming numbers, often in open areas or improvised conditions, because of fears that damaged buildings might not withstand further shaking. The World Health Organization reported a major need for emergency trauma care, medical supplies, and field support during the early response period. Triage became a grim necessity, with doctors and nurses forced to prioritize those they could save fastest while still trying to care for everyone arriving at once. At the same time, survival became about more than rescue from rubble. Hundreds of thousands of people were suddenly without safe shelter, and many were too frightened to go back indoors, even if their homes were still standing. Families gathered in school grounds, parks, roadsides, and open fields, building temporary cover from tarpaulins, blankets, and salvaged materials. Clean water, food, sanitation, and basic medical help quickly became pressing concerns. Aid agencies warned that the disaster was evolving from an immediate search and rescue emergency into a wider humanitarian crisis. What made those days especially cruel was the uncertainty. Survivors waited for news of relatives, rescuers worked against the clock beneath unstable ruins, and whole communities listened for the sound of helicopters or shouted voices in the debris. In disasters like this, time is measured differently. Each hour can mean the difference between rescue and recovery, between hope and grief. Nepal's race against time had begun, and it was being run across shattered cities, remote valleys, and mountains that made every act of help harder won. Even after the first great shock had passed, Nepal was not given the chance to breathe. Powerful aftershocks continued to strike, deepening fear and adding fresh destruction to a country already struggling to cope. On the 12th of May 2015, less than 3 weeks after the main earthquake, a major aftershock of magnitude 7.3 hit near the Chinese border east of Kathmandu. It killed more people, damaged buildings that had survived the first quake, and sent traumatized residents back into open spaces once again. For many survivors, the disaster no longer felt like a single event. It felt like a crisis that kept returning just when they thought they might begin to recover. The human toll was immense. Nepal's National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Authority records the 25th of April earthquake at 7.6 magnitude, with 8,969 deaths and 22,314 injuries, while international summaries commonly round the event to magnitude 7.8 and note that nearly 9,000 people were killed. Hundreds of thousands of homes were destroyed, and many more were damaged, leaving millions affected across dozens of districts. The disaster was especially severe in rural hill areas, where access was difficult and whole settlements could remain isolated long after global attention had focused on Kathmandu. Aid began pouring in from inside Nepal and from around the world. Governments, charities, military aircraft, and humanitarian agencies delivered food, shelter materials, medical supplies, and specialist rescue support. The UN launched a flash appeal for hundreds of millions of dollars to help fund relief operations, while organizations such as the Red Cross, WHO, and UNICEF worked on shelter, sanitation, healthcare, and child protection. Yet getting help where it was needed was not easy. Nepal's terrain was punishing, roads were blocked, the weather threatened to complicate logistics, and damage to infrastructure slowed the flow of supplies. In some places, people waited days for significant outside assistance to arrive. The strain was not only physical, it was emotional, social, and political. Families were grieving, thousands were sleeping under temporary cover, schools and heritage sites were wrecked, and the monsoon season was approaching like an unwelcome deadline. Relief distribution also came under scrutiny, as survivors and officials alike wrestled with the gap between urgent need and limited capacity. Disasters have a nasty habit of exposing every weakness at once. In Nepal, that meant poverty, fragile infrastructure, difficult geography, and the enormous challenge of rebuilding a country while it was still shaking. The 2015 Nepal earthquake did not end when the ground stopped moving. Its true aftermath stretched across years, shaping how Nepal rebuilt its homes, protected its heritage, and thought about the risks of living in the shadow of the Himalayas. Nearly 9,000 people were killed, thousands more were injured, and the damage ran into billions of dollars, but the legacy of the disaster cannot be measured only in numbers. It also lived on in empty places at family tables, in temple squares missing the structures that had defined them for generations, and in the national determination to rebuild stronger than before. One of the biggest long-term challenges was housing reconstruction. Nepal had to rebuild not just quickly but differently. The disaster exposed how dangerous poor construction standards could be in a major seismic zone, especially in rural districts where traditional building methods were common and resources were limited. In the years that followed, reconstruction efforts increasingly focused on earthquake-resilient housing, with the World Bank describing Nepal's owner-driven rebuilding program as one of the largest post-disaster housing reconstruction efforts of its kind, helping support the construction of over 300,000 more resilient homes. The idea was not simply to replace what had been lost, but to reduce the chances of the same scale of loss happening again. The earthquake also left a deep mark on Nepal's cultural identity. Historic sites across the Kathmandu Valley were damaged or destroyed, including temples, palaces, and monuments that connected modern Nepal to centuries of religious and civic life. UNESCO later noted that around 2,900 heritage structures of cultural and religious value were affected by the April and May 2015 earthquakes, underlining how much of the country's architectural inheritance had been placed at risk. Restoration became about more than bricks and timber. It was also about recovering memory, continuity, and pride. Even years later, the rebuilding of heritage sites remained a visible symbol of Nepal's resilience. There were broader lessons too. The earthquake became a reminder that disasters are never purely natural. Tectonic forces may be unavoidable, but death tolls and damage levels are shaped by building standards, preparedness, infrastructure, governance, and the speed of response. The recovery process pushed Nepal towards stronger institutions for reconstruction and preparedness, including the establishment of the National Reconstruction Authority in late 2015. That did not erase the pain, nor did it make recovery simple, but it showed that the country was trying to turn catastrophe into hard-earned knowledge. So what did the 2015 Nepal earthquake leave behind? Grief, certainly. Ruin, undeniably. But it also left a changed Nepal, one forced to rebuild its houses, reassemble parts of its history, and reckon with the reality that the mountains are magnificent, partly because they are restless. It was a national tragedy, but also a national lesson, written in stone, dust, memory, and resilience. That brings us to the end of this episode of Compact Disasters, part of the Compact Histories Network. If you enjoyed it, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss any future episodes. And consider leaving a rating or review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. You can find more episodes at compactdisasters.com, where you can also explore our other podcasts covering biographies, history, true crime, warfare, and mysteries. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Finally, please consider supporting the show directly by buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/disasterscoffee to see how. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.